Ymedia Group, the fastest growing media group in North America.
Hello and welcome back to Ymedia Newsroom. I'm Ramona Singh, and we're going to talk about the Canada-U.S. relations when it comes to Cusma. The latest is that the U.S. officials are effectively asking Canada for an entry fee before formal trade talks begin. The entry fee is not money, but it's concessions. Essentially, it's saying that Canada must make concessions first before negotiating on new or updated deal, such as Cusma, before it actually starts. Essentially, Canada is saying that they've already made concessions but haven't received anything in return. So this is the latest development. We know Prime Minister Mark Carney has his majority government right now. It's a newly majority government since the 3 by-elections and the 5 MPs that crossed the floor. And essentially now he's put together a council, which we covered for you with Erin O'Toole and Lisa Raitt and Ralph Goodale. He's picked people from all sides of the aisle to be the advisor going into Cusma. And, we covered for you his 8-minute plus video that he released over the weekend of, it's hard times and that Canada's reliance on the US isn't the best thing. And I think all Canadians are realizing that if these talks don't go as well, perhaps he was preparing us for what could come out of these talks and really, lowering the bar of expectations. But it is quite devastating if the outcome is not positive, and I will explain why. So essentially, the United States is saying before we have our talks, we need some concessions, right? And what they called it in terms of entry fee, right? So we're not talking about literal money, but essentially saying that it's policy concessions up front should be like dropping tariffs, changing domestic policies, scrapping taxes, targeting US companies, something. They're saying, give it to us in good faith for us to even before we negotiate. And, Canada already did, right? So Canada already scrapped its digital services tax, if you recall, to ease its tension. And that was, if you recall, it was like on any sort of media, there was a digital tax, right, to be able to monetize. And therefore, if you recall, there was a time period where you can get any news on Facebook like you used to. So that was introduced under Prime Minister Trudeau's government. So this was scrapped, right? And then if you recall, the other concession was under Prime Minister Justin Trudeau when the $2 billion were sent for more border security. If you recall earlier on last year when we're talking about tariffs, because President Trump said it was fentanyl crossing the border, illegal migrants crossing the border. So then Canada, speedy, $2 billion investment, amplified its security, border security, and then we still had tariffs. So it's a situation, if I were to translate what Trump is saying or what the Americans are saying under President Trump in this negotiation, is give us something first, then we'll talk, right? To this strategy, it seems that Prime Minister Mark Carney is not bowing down to, right? So the U.S. is the dominant player, right? If you want to look at like who's at play here, right? If we want to take a look at the players, who's got leverage, who doesn't have leverage, what's there to lose? Well, yeah, the U.S. is the dominant partner in this relationship of Canada and United States. We have, our ministers even saying that we're at a disadvantage. We've had Prime Minister Justin Trudeau say we're at a disadvantage, and it looks like President Trump is going to exploit that disadvantage of how much we rely on our southern neighbor for our economy, right? So that's the reality. 70% of our exports go to the United States, right? Essentially, Canada has only one really big client when it comes to Canadian oil. Canada has the 4th largest reserves of oil in the world, and our biggest client is the United States that takes the crude oil from Alberta, and it goes directly to the United States. And, they have the capabilities to refine Albertan oil. Meanwhile, us here in Ontario and Eastern Canada, we refine foreign oil, right? We don't have refineries that match our own oil from Alberta. That's got the fourth largest reserve in the world of oil. We essentially take Saudi Arabia oil, Nigeria, Venezuela, and that's why Ontarians, our prices are up, right? That's why we're exposed to the war the same way. We don't have the same domestic consumption. We export most of our oil. And so, given that Canada has essentially integrated itself so deeply with the United States for its economic lifeline, and when you have, disruption like this, like President Trump is creating disruption, right? Changing the status quo, what would create stability and predictability, and he's changing that. And given that they are the dominant partner, they can call the shots, essentially, right? So this is why we've seen Prime Minister Mark Carney travel the world his first year as Prime Minister and try to do trade agreements with other countries. But what country is going to replace 70% of exports, Canadian exports that go to the United States? What country? Is it going to be multiple countries? Will they be able to fill the gap of that 70% export? That's to be known, and that's what we're waiting to hear from our Prime Minister, and essentially what would come out of this Cusma agreement. So essentially, Canada heavily, heavily depends on the US for trade, right? It's just a reality. So say what you will about President Trump, say what you will about his administration. The bottom line is our job security, our economic security, the Canadian dollar value, it all depends on the US as our partner. And so the US can do multiple things. They could delay talks, they can maintain tariffs, they can increase pressure, right? Because they're the dominating partner. And essentially, this is, what we've seen classic Trump negotiations tactics, right? To force concessions before sitting at the table, right? Which is what we've seen play out in the US-Iran war, right? But that's a different thing. If you recall, before going back to that for momentarily, before the US-Iran ceasefire on April 7th, essentially the US was asking for a 45-day ceasefire. And during that time, they said, okay, we'll talk. And Iran said, no, no, no. We don't want a 45-day ceasefire of no guarantees. We want to have a ceasefire to talk about end of war plan, not we'll see if we negotiate, we'll see what the terms are. And then they said, here are the 10 points. So that's how that played out. When it comes to Canada, well, same sort of thing, right? Give us the concession, right? Force the concession of what are you willing to give up? And then we'll sit at the table, right? So this is, this negotiation approach it's equal to maximum pressure first, right? And we've seen this before during NAFTA renegotiations, right? NAFTA was the previous free trade agreement, the North America Free Trade Agreement. That was replaced by Cusma. And then we've seen tariffs take place after Cusma was negotiated and in full effect, right? Canada saw those tariffs. So now the US is probing to see what are Canada's limits, right? So how much is Canada going to concede? And how much will they concede up front, right? What concessions will they make? So now whether Canada will walk away or keep giving ground to the United States is really what is the Americans, that's what they're measuring right now. So Canada has already, like I mentioned, invested the $2 billion for border strategy, right? The US Canada border, because of what he said was fentanyl crisis. And then Canada already dropped some of its retaliatory tariffs, if you recall. And then also it removed its digital tax, which was a major concession for Canada. And yet, what Canada has seen that the talks have not meaningfully advanced, right? So essentially, understanding that concessions do not equal progress in talks with the United States on Cusma, right? So here's what could happen if talks stall completely. You know, if Canada refuses and says, okay, well, we're not going to give the concessions up front, then, you know, the United States could say, okay, well, we don't need to have, you know, the talks in this favor and then go really hard line. So that's one risk. The other risk is that Canada agrees to concessions before the Cusma conversations start, then it risks giving too much upfront, right? If you give too much upfront, what are you going to negotiate when you're at the table for Cusma, right? You're negotiating for, you know, 40 plus million Canadians, right? Their livelihood and future Canadians and the Canadian economy and its trajectory of growth and GDP and young Canadians who hope to have a decent standard of living here in Canada. And so that is what you're negotiating. So if you give concessions before you negotiate on Cusma, you risk giving up too much upfront. And then what do you have in your back pocket to negotiate on? Right? There's Canadian energy, which is huge. So that's to be seen. So now here's the situation, right? Given that Canada is heavily reliant on the US market and it has limited short-term alternatives. Yeah, it does. What are its alternatives? Who is it going to replace for 70% of its exports? And in a short time, because the Cusma talks begin on July 1st. The Prime Minister has been at his job for a little over a year, right? Cusma talks start on July 1st. And in the short term, who is going to replace America for Canada? And is that even possible, right? That's the question that remains. So what this means is that, you know, this is the weakness, is what Prime Minister Mark Carney was, you know, talking about in his 8-minute video that he released this past weekend to Canadians, right? So essentially, and also, if the concessions are made, it also doesn't mean that the Americans will come along and come up to a win-win situation. It doesn't mean anything at all. It just means I gave something away to the Americans. So that is really what is, you know, what the president wants to see in terms of the U.S. demanding concessions from Canada before trade talks even begin, a move that's raising concerns about Canada's leverage and I guess the future of what is this most important economic relationship that Canada must have, right? So now Mark Carney is saying, you know, that the U.S. cannot dictate terms, right? And saying that Mark Carney's words are, "We negotiate, we don't take orders." So really, Mark Carney is showing that he's going to stand up to the United States. Now, what are the items that the U.S. is pushing on? Essentially, there is the supply management, right? So Canada's got a supply management system, right, on dairy, poultry, eggs, essentially having a price cap at what it could sell it for, right? Not responding to the market amount, right? So not a free market situation. That's why it's called a supply management system. And it sets the benchmark for how much money must be made on Canadian dairy, poultry, and eggs, okay? This is done to protect Canadian farmers, and this is something that the U.S. is saying that is too high. It's not going with the market rate, right? That it's inflating a price, essentially, you know, not a tariff, but, you know, an inflated price. And so this is something that Canada has always maintained in all its negotiations and NAFTA and the Cusma, to be able to protect Canadian farmers and to make sure that there's a priced item for those things, and therefore there's predictability when it comes to Canadian agriculture, and the supply management system is a key part of that, right? Which really affects a province like Quebec significantly as well. And then we've seen in the past little while since the tariff talks that we've had a real buy Canadian policy, right? Favoring domestic workers, domestic products. If you notice now, if you watch a Canadian commercial, right, on TV, if it's a Canadian product, we'll always say proudly Canadian, right? Canada's gym, Canada's donut shop, it's that flag that people are looking for. And we've seen this whole, and then we've also seen tourism numbers drop, right, to the United States. And that was part of Mark Carney's message, travel within Canada, keep the dollars in Canada. Don't spend your hard work money in the United States. And we also saw that with the snowbirds, right? The Canadians who live 6 months out of the year in Florida or elsewhere in the United States, we saw them, also selling their accommodations there and staying back here. So these are some really sensitive things. But what's happening now is that Canada is starting this negotiation from a weaker position. And I'll tell you why. Because Canada hasn't even started formally talks yet, right? Our talks are scheduled for July 1st. Meanwhile, the US has already started this negotiation with Mexico. So Canada is in this seen as like behind the process. And what we want to know is, what is Canada's plan for its partnership with Mexico? Because that's a key thing for Mexican exports, right? But then what will they import from Canada? So that's a massive thing. And so just a big number here, right? Cusma deadline, review deadline is July 1st, 2026. 70% plus of, some say 70, some say 75%, Canadian exports go to the United States. It is a structural dependence, economic dependence on the United States. And then we've already seen the US impose tariffs on steel, aluminum, and auto industry. We saw those massive layoffs with the auto plants in Ontario. And we know that Canada's already made its concessions. We're talking about $3.5 billion trade daily between the Canada-US border. $3.5 billion daily. So that is massive, that Canada cannot, find a replacement for in the short term. I don't know about long term. And so this is a massive thing that, of course, once these trade talks begin and the review begins, we're going to cover it significantly for you. And what it means for Canada in terms of, this trade. And we know that Canada, Prime Minister Mark Carney went over to China to do a trade agreement. We know that Chinese cars will come to Canada. We know BYD, which is just Chinese car company, is going to open up 20 different car dealerships in Canada. So we know that's thing, and then we know that President Trump has pushed back on that, right? Essentially, America First agenda, right? Saying that they worry that Canada would be the back door for Chinese goods, because Canada and US have the biggest border, and essentially if Canada imports Chinese goods, Chinese vehicles, then it would enter the American market, affecting the American auto industry like Ford, Chrysler, and the rest of them. So essentially, that is a big thing. Of course, long-standing trade disputes have been on softwood lumber, steel, aluminum tariffs, agriculture, supply management, what I talked about earlier. So those are some of the critical things. Essentially, this negotiation is going to set up, the key thing on market access, policy, on some of these things, and the U.S. wanting to see fewer protectionism from Canada. Meanwhile, it wants to maintain its America First protectionism policies. So this is a big deal, right? That we're going to, of course, bring you the latest as it develops.